pacing, storytelling, and a sense of reward, let's look at exactly what makes a boss fight great. According to Wikipedia, the first boss battle ever featured in a game was the Gold Dragon in the 1975 RPG D&D. Since then, they've been a ubiquitous part of many video games, some brilliant, some less so. But what exactly is it that makes a boss fight good? Hello, I'm Matt, and in this video, with the help of some great Gama Sutra articles, we'll be exploring the elements that bring a boss battle to life. We'll be looking at things like rewards, anticipation, and pacing, and showing how a good boss fight is the perfect opportunity for a player to demonstrate their mastery over a game. And we'll be looking at where designers start when deciding what a boss should be, and it's probably not what you expect. And if you enjoy this video, please remember to subscribe to the channel for similar features, and if you are already subscribed, hit that notification bell to know when our next video goes live. Load up on healing items and prepare to aim for the glowing weak spot. Let's delve into exactly what makes a boss fight great. Alright, so this is an unusual place to start for a video about making brilliant boss fights, but it's important to point out that you don't always need them for a game to be good. Crowbarring these moments into a game that never needed them can have a detrimental effect, so the first, and perhaps most important point to make, is that some games are better without them. A PC Gamer article about exactly this uses the example of the Fontaine fight at the end of BioShock. You've already had a memorable encounter with Andrew Ryan, not to mention numerous thrilling mini-boss fights with the big daddies throughout the game. So the giant, glowing, naked finale feels strangely clumsy.
Come and get it!
This is a lesson Batman developers Rocksteady have clearly learned over time. We've gone from the oddly repetitive boss battles of Arkham Asylum to the more personal, memorable finale of Arkham Knight. Yes, there were boss fights, but they weren't used to clumsily bookend the story. But that's enough of that, let's dig in to what makes boss fights good.
Exactly where to shoot.
Much of what we'll talk about in this video comes from an article by Mike Stout, a designer who's worked for Activision and Insomniac, who spent a career perfecting boss fights. And one of the key messages in the article is that a boss fight should test specific skills. These tests can be of anything: movement, blocking, jumping, and so forth, and they form the basis for how the boss should act. And Stout suggests thinking of a specific attack to test whichever element you pick. The example he uses is testing the player's skill at jumping with the classic ground-based ring attack, countered by hopping over the edge of the ring as it approaches the player. But there are many more complex examples. And we can find some good examples in Dark Souls because yes, of course I'm going to talk about Dark Souls, even when they're never as specific as jumping over an area of effect attack. They still represent the same principle. The fight against the Capra Demon, which takes place in an area the size of a postage stamp, is a test of how you dodge and block. Similarly, the fight against the Four Kings demands that you prioritize your damage output, or the kings will keep respawning and you'll be there indefinitely. Because yes, the 4 bit of that boss name is a massive lie. These fights force you to observe, learn, adapt, or die, and that sense of training is something we'll come back to later on. But this idea of prioritizing attacks over design is interesting because it's probably the opposite of what we expect from a boss. That doesn't mean that bosses can't have character, but if you're testing a player's skill, it's smart to begin with attacks and work backwards. So we've established that a good boss has loads of cool attacks that will test us as players, but a smart designer needs to make sure that the boss actually gets to use them. Stout explains that the one thing that immediately ruins a fight is when a boss has poor defense. Things like letting a player use the same attacks repeatedly to cheese their way to victory, or attacks that keep a boss in a state where they don't actually get to attack you. Another way he suggests you can avoid this is by giving bosses the ability to withdraw from the fight, which is something we see all the time. A good example from an older game comes from Final Fight. There are moments where the boss can somersault out of combat and call in some grunts to slow you down. You can also allow the boss to attack without being interrupted, which is something we see all the time in Dark Souls. Stout's other examples include force fields that can be applied when the boss attacks, bosses flying out of range, and knockback attacks, all of which put the priority back on the player avoiding or understanding the attacks rather than offense. Next, Stout talks about how every boss fight is a story, and in the best boss fights, this story begins even before you reach them. He likens this to promotion in a boxing match or MMA bout. It's about hype. You need to know what's happening before you reach the boss, whether it's through cutscenes, environmental storytelling, or dialogue. A great example of this is the ninja fight in Metal Gear Solid. During the build-up, you're assailed with cutscenes of the ninja ruthlessly killing soldiers and showing off skills far beyond Snake's. So when you finally reach him, you're fully aware of the challenge that awaits you. All of this builds anticipation, raising the emotional stakes and making the fight feel more like a monumental event. This also relates to the big reveal of the boss. When you finally reach them, they need a big introduction. Think of it like pyro and entrance music before a wrestling match.
I've waited a long time for this day. Now I want to enjoy the moment.
This is the game's chance to show us how awesome, quirky, or interesting the boss is. The game has our attention, and it has to tell us that yes, we have reached a pivotal moment. I mentioned earlier that a good boss fight starts with process, but they still need to have personality. The best bosses can be conceptually understood with a single glance. Another Gamasutra article about Shovel Knight bosses deals specifically with this, and the cool ways developers can weave a boss's personality into their movements. The article explains how each boss has to be distinct. Their movements and animation should match their personality. This involves looking at the attacks that have been designed and matching that up with the type of character that you're creating. In Shovel Knight, for example, the theme of the world, the theme of the character, and the personality of the character all had to be cohesive. The example they use is King Knight, an arrogant, grandiose character who swaggers about the level and attacks you with celebratory trumpets. You only need to look at his attacks to know exactly what kind of character he is. As I mentioned before, a boss is a test of skill, so as well as giving you the narrative foundation for fighting the boss, a good designer will also subconsciously train you in the abilities needed to beat them. The example Stout uses here is the fight against GLaDOS in Portal. You need 2 specific skills to defeat her, and the game goes out of its way to teach you both of them in a way you'll never forget. One of the things you have to do to defeat GLaDOS is incinerate her personality cores as they fall off. And how do you know what to do? Because previously, you've had to do the same thing to your only friend in the game, the weighted companion cube.
You euthanized your faithful companion cube more quickly than any test subject on record.
It's the sort of moment that's impossible to forget, and it means you're fully prepped when you reach the finale. Plus, you're getting delicious revenge.
A big party that all your friends were invited to. I invited your best friend, the companion cube.
Elsewhere, you've already fought an indestructible robot that fires missiles at you and learned you can redirect those missiles to your own advantage. Again, this is exactly what you need to defeat GLaDOS. Not every game will be generous enough to teach you these things beforehand. From soft games famously force you to learn and adapt during boss fights, but there's always that underlying sense that you have to perfect new skills in order to proceed. In the article, Stout talks about setting the intensity at the start of the fight. He calls this business as usual. This is where the players familiarize themselves with attack patterns and the intensity of the fight. Is this a breathless battle for survival or a slow, cerebral grind? In the early stages, we need to learn how we're going to fight the boss, and if we need to learn something new, this is the point the game has to teach us. Sometimes, like at the start of the fight against GLaDOS, you're not in any immediate danger and it gives you some time to acclimatise. Other times, such as in most of the fights in Dark Souls, you can still easily lose in this phase, but you're also aware that things will probably get worse. And that leads us to our next point, escalation. As the fight escalates, a good boss will try new attacks and the difficulty level will increase. Most Dark Souls bosses have this, whether it's a mid-fight transformation or a rapid increase in difficulty. Sometimes this phase can allow the player a momentary break to reassess what's happening, often in the form of a false victory or death of some kind. How many times have you fought a suspiciously easy boss only to have them die and come back 10 times stronger? It's a trick used to give us a chance to take a breath, but also to tell a story and make you more excited about what's to come. And after all that drama, you need a reward. Stout suggests showing the enemy on the ropes, giving players a moment to revel in their victory. The boss might not actually die in this bit, but you basically know you've won. There are loads of interesting examples of this. One of the most vivid is the fight against Sif, the Great Grey Wolf in Dark Souls. After a difficult fight, you notice this noble beast begin to limp around. You feel amazing because you've won, but there's also a sense of guilt for killing something so magnificent. It's a great example of storytelling in a boss fight. It's also important at this stage that the player doesn't feel robbed. The boss can't just run away before the player has a chance to bask in the glow of victory. And the worst offender of all is the player being defeated in a cutscene after they've beaten the boss. Everybody hates that. This is our opportunity to feel great about the amazing thing we've just done, even if it's just a classic Dark Souls explosion of souls and a moment of quiet, safe reflection. To wrap up, we'll briefly look at what boss fights provide in the wider context of a game. Primarily, they should be a reward that gives the rest of the game meaning. Stout describes it almost like a gift from the designer to the player, although not every boss fight will feel like that, and as a chance for us to take a break and do something new. They should bring a sense of completion, whether it's the end of a chapter or the grand finale. As players, we should feel like we've achieved a goal that provides tangible progression, be it a story revelation or an emotional milestone. And finally, bosses build and release tension that can inform the rest of a level. As gamers, we know the signs that suggest a boss battle is imminent, and it changes the way we feel. We all recognise the wide open spaces or a game's sudden generosity with health and ammo. And all of this works to help build intensity over the course of a game. And once the boss is defeated and that intensity is released, it feels amazing. You'll feel good about your achievements and expect to have things easy, at least for a little bit. So for example, you've just defeated the Chaos Witch Quelaag and you get to relax for a while in Sen's Fortress, or maybe not. So by combining all of these elements, we can see that a good boss fight doesn't just last for the duration of the fight itself, but the entire period before and after it takes place. So there we go, you've reached the end and claimed your reward. Please hit that like button if you love a good boss fight and let us know your favourites in the comments below. And please subscribe to Logitech G if you're not already, and remember to hit the bell of awakening so you know when our next upload goes live.